Hello and welcome to Caves Across Apologetics. I'm Patrick,
And I'm Tony.
and we're in the midst of Chapter 9 of our book, Scientism and Secularism by J.P. Moreland. And we talked last time on Chapter 8 about how different types of mental states are not physical. And I know it seems odd of going for a full chapter of that rather than saying, well, duh. But this is science after all, and we have to complicate things more for the sake of over clarification there. And so in this chapter, it's going to be interesting is he's going to kind of put forth a case of kind of what philosophical starting point he views, although he's not going to hold on to it for the sake of just you being impressed that he holds on to it, but to further make the point of having this distinction between what scientism says, which is that science can the natural science can explain and give all facts to you that are worth having, especially for the hard scientism, or even the soft scientism having this allowance for maybe certain other things. And what he's trying to get at here is that that there's just two drastically different camps that can give you knowledge, and we shouldn't poo-poo science, but we should also understand that the fish can't climb the tree in that instance. And so he's going to talk here in Chapter 9 about scientism and first philosophy. And again, those two are kind of opposing forces there. He goes on to say in the beginning of the chapter that the chapter will argue that biblical studies and theology must join forces with a classical view of first philosophy. Sadly, today, neither scientists nor theologians know very much of philosophy. As a result, their view and conclusions are often shallow and prematurely formed. The purpose of recovering this first philosophy is so that we can, 1, gain a broader and deeper view of reality than scientism can provide, and 2, have an appropriate intellectual vantage point from which to provide persuasive criticism of scientism and science itself, at least when it was drawn faulty conclusions by disregarding the philosophical and theological components of the topic. And far be it for me to continue the bandwagon of saying the degradation of society, but as far as the classical view of education, that work should have all been done in the primary schools. And really the philosophical underpinnings of science, the specialization is what you went to the universities, the early universities for. Those established by the intelligentsia of Christianity and the West. And so the philosophical underpinnings seem to be unmatured because all we have done, especially since the 50s, is specialization. And so that's something hopefully that will be corrected in the near future. And I'm trying with at least my two kids. So the rest of you get on it. So
All right, so notice what he says here. First philosophy does two things for us, right? It helps us to gain a broader and deeper view of reality. Notice, than scientism can provide. So first philosophy gives us some insight into reality that scientism can't give us. And secondly, that, it provides a persuasive criticism of scientism and of science itself, at least when it draws faulty conclusions. So those are two things that, first philosophy can give us there. And of course, the folks who hold to scientism are going to reject this because they believe that science, is the end all and be all. And so that's what the first thing he talks about in this section of the chapter, the war against first philosophy, right? So, man, batten the hatches and man your side. He says, what exactly is first philosophy first? So what is it? And he says, roughly, first philosophy is the notion that there is a realm of rational investigation. There's a realm of rational investigation that, 1, is the proper domain of philosophy, 2, is independent of, indeed more basic or fundamental than science, right? That is, science is built upon the foundation of the results of first philosophy. And then thirdly, it gives us knowledge of the topic studied in that realm, including knowledge of reality. So first philosophy is a particular realm of rational investigation. Well, I thought we only investigated for science. No. He tells us first philosophy allows us to investigate as well, right? It's the proper domain of philosophy. First philosophy is obviously given the name. It's independent of science, right? And it gives us knowledge of reality that are not part of what we can't learn from science. So those are the things. So if that's the case, why are folks at war with first philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. It takes the dollars away from him. That's why.
Yeah.
Well, he goes on to say that philosopher George Beeler, an advocate of first philosophy, has unpacked first philosophy into the following two theses. The first he calls the autonomy of philosophy, areas of philosophical investigations that lie completely outside competence of science. Right, so you can't put it into the natural sciences. It falls so far outside that it's its own thing. Debates about abstract objects, like whether or not there are numbers, sets, and so forth, that exist outside space and time, right? There's your forms, again, an area where you study it in philosophy class, not in science class. The second thesis he calls the authority of philosophy, areas which science and philosophy both investigate where the philosophical factors carry more weight than and trump those of science. The question of whether unobservable theoretical entities of science exist, like electrons, are merely useful fictions, or the nature of time.
Right. So those are two things here that Beeler has noted here. The autonomy of philosophy, there are things that it talks about that are outside, and so it's more independent than science. And the authority of philosophy, there are things that philosophy can speak authoritative of that science cannot speak of, right? So those are two of the kind of issues with regard to first philosophy. And so it tells us what happens then when we reject first philosophy. Well, the replacement of first philosophy with science, right, in other words, right, the emergence of scientism has radically altered the default worldview of the West, replacing Christian theism with naturalistic materialism. So first, worldview alteration is the first result of reading first philosophy. Even though it has all of these benefits, we reject, if we replace it, we reject a particular worldview. Secondly, he tells us, besides having an impact on changing the major worldview in the West, the rejection of first philosophy has changed many, in fact, he says maybe most philosophers' conception of what philosophy is all about. It goes without saying, he tells that for over 2,500 years, philosophers took themselves to be providing truth and knowledge of reality, knowing, values, and so forth, but they no longer do.
Right. It's really hard. So if we just don't do it, then all we have to do is just our science experiments, and then we're good. We don't have to do so much. Well, the currently prevailing view is that only science gives us knowledge of reality, not philosophy. So what does philosophy do? Well, according to Scientism advocate David Papanou, the task of philosophers is to bring coherence and order to the total set of assumptions we use in science to explain the empirical world. So it sets it up in nice, orderly Excel spreadsheets. That's what the philosophers do. In other words, philosophers don't study reality, they study the assumptions of science to help scientists make sure their assumptions fit well together and are nicely ordered. Again, your A, B's into your conclusion are there just to provide the steps in order to do the science experiment. But don't look at the man behind the curtain.
That's right. And so how does scientism then change the purpose of philosophy? Well, it tells us philosopher Daniel Stojar correctly notes that for many philosophers, their task is to reduce the common sense view to or replace it by the physicalistic worldview certified by hard science. So notice what Jar is suggesting here. What is the purpose of philosophy? It's to help us to make this reduction so that we can understand the physical world, to reduce the non-physical descriptions or whatever with physical things that the hard science deals with. That's the purpose of philosophy, not to gain knowledge or, get knowledge in and of itself or have a different area of knowledge, but to help science, right, with regard to this reduction project. He says, as we've seen so far in the book, and as we'll see in the future chapters, the idea is that the purpose of philosophy is to find a way to reduce or get rid of things that cannot be located in a strictly physical world. And of course, he believes that's a disaster.
Right. So it doesn't actually help or anything. It's the cheerleader.
Right.
You're playing Nintendo with your little brother, and instead of giving up your turn because you died, well, if you just tell me when the enemies are on the screen and when to jump, then I'll know what to do. And so you are helping me and still getting a turn at the same time. But no, you can't play. Only I can play. But why reject first philosophy? He goes on to say here to begin with. Why not be thankful for science, but also be grateful that there are other ways of knowing that gives us knowledge of reality, and hold that philosophy is fundamental. As he suggested, the literature on these questions, most arguments against first philosophy merely start with a question-begging assumption of scientism. Moreland goes on to say that I have surveyed the literature on these questions, and most arguments, and he puts around arguments there, against first philosophy merely start with a question-begging assumption of scientism. Who would have thought? Well, according to Papineau, for example, if we're going to study the nature of the human mind, we must start with assumptions. Moreland says, really? I don't think we start with assumptions. Rather, we start with our direct introspective awareness of our conscious states. Is our knowledge of the nature of a pain an assumption? No, it's something we know directly by first-person experience. Maybe reading too many philosophy papers gives you pain. So as he reads Papineau, he offers very little by the way of arguments for this scientific starting point. He just assumes it. And I thought we weren't supposed to do that in science.
Yeah. All right. So that's one kind of argument about why first philosophy was rejected, because we have to start with assumptions, scientific assumptions and that sort of thing. And so we have to reject first philosophy. He says, but there is an argument against first philosophy, or at least an implicit argument based on the claim that philosophical knowledge must be rejected because philosophers can't agree about anything. So there's another one, right? Can't agree, those bonehead philosophers, right? But besides, he says, the fact that scientists disagree more than most people think, this statement itself, notice he says, is a philosophical assertion.
Ooh.
It assumes an epistemological view, namely that knowledge requires agreement by the experts. So this is not a scientific assertion, right? And so as a result, it's self-refuting. Right. If uttered by an advocate of strong scientism, it is a philosophical statement that says that only scientific statements and not philosophical ones can be true and known to be such, right? So there it is. You're making this statement that is, if you apply it to itself, it refutes itself. And so it doesn't work, right? And so that's the second issue with regard to this kind of argument against first philosophy.
Right. If we don't all think alike, because again, evolution gave us survivability, so why should we assume that we'd all come to the same conclusion, unless if there's things like objective nature and the ability to come to a common knowledge and the values and the oughts and being able to share that in a truthful way. Oh man, all the towers is coming a crumbling down. All right, so he goes on to say, but in my view, the most widely stated argument against first philosophy is that those who accept it do so because they hold to a faulty view of knowledge known as Cartesian foundationalism. As Patricia Churchland proclaims, it is in this sense that there is no first philosophy. There's no corpus of philosophical doctrine concerning science and epistemology such that we can be sure it is the truth to which all scientism must conform. There is no Archimedean point outside all science from which we can pronounce upon the acceptability of scientific theories. This Cartesian foundationalism is this, can you be absolutely sure? Well, no, I'm not absolutely sure. I'm not 100%. I'm 99%. Well, then we can't know anything. And so therefore we can't even get off the ground. And so it just must be rejected. But also let's go and make a computer.
That's right. So he's going to make a distinction between foundationalism itself and Cartesian foundationalism as we go here. So he says, Papineau says pretty much the same thing. He says this argument, that is for first philosophy, depends on the assumption that knowledge needs to be certain in the sense that it should derive from methods that necessarily deliver truth. So if you hold that knowledge requires certainty, as Cartesian foundationalism holds, then you will hold that philosophy needs to come before science. And so notice they reject first philosophy because of this notion of Cartesian foundationalism, because Cartesian foundationalism says we have to have certainty. And of course, we can't have that. And therefore, if we can't have that, then we have to reject first philosophy. That's the basic idea. And he says, unfortunately for Churchland and Papineau and others who use this argument, is entirely, he believes, wrong-headed and more than 50 years out of date. And so he's going to help us to see this and get clear about Cartesian foundationalism. And he wants to take a look at some background issues in epistemology. So let's go ahead on and jump into epistemology, the nature of knowledge here, and see what he has to tell us.
Right. And again, let's point out the claim here if you hold the knowledge requires certainty, then you'll hold that philosophy needs to come before science. And then, there's just a lot of baked in assumptions here. Like you must hold on to this. Okay, well, Mr. Scientist man, do an experiment that shows me that.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, we can't. Okay, well then it seems like you're not talking scientifically, you're talking, philosophically. All right, so foundationalism. We can accept some beliefs on the basis of accepting other beliefs. Right. I hear a rustling sound outside due to the movement of leaves on our tree. I realize that a wind is blowing. My belief that there is a wind blowing is based on and justified my belief that the leaves are rustling. The first belief, that there is a wind blowing, is indirect, that it is justified mediately, that is through or by the means of the second belief, that the leaves are rustling.
So notice what he's trying to do now is to help us to understand what foundationalism is all about. We accept certain beliefs on the basis of accepting other beliefs, right? That's the notion. And so what we're going to get to now is, what is this basis? What is this foundation? That's what he wants us to get to in foundationalism. He says, for the foundationalists, epistemic chains of justification stop with beliefs that are not justified on the basis of other beliefs. So this belief is based on this belief, and this belief is based on this belief, and so forth. But we stop somewhere, and where we stop, that's the foundation. And so he says, for the foundationalists, all beliefs are either basic or non-basic. Basic beliefs are not justified solely by their connection to other beliefs, but that does not mean that they're not justified by something. Most foundationalists, he tells us, will say that a properly basic belief is justified by an experience, right? Or by the way the belief was formed properly by relevant, that is, visual or something, faculty. And so the foundationalists, he suggests, have criteria for their basic beliefs. When do we stop? Well, the basic belief stops at, for instance, an experience, right? Some type of, a visual experience, auditory experience, something like that, right? Sensations, that kind of stuff. And so, for example, he says, my belief that the wind is blowing is justified by my belief that the leaves are rustling. And this later belief, the leaves are rustling, is justified by my belief that I hear, there's the experience, the leaves rustling. And so this final belief is properly basic. This sensational belief, sensation, is properly basic. It's not justified by other beliefs. It's justified by experience. Namely, I seem to hear the rustling of leaves. And so foundationalists try to get us to these foundational beliefs that we can hold to and build other beliefs on top of those beliefs, right? And experience is one of those that a foundationalist would suggest is a foundational belief, right, or a basic belief.
Right. All right. So what about Cartesian foundationalism?
Well, that's different, right?
Right. Exactly. Now we are in a position to state what Cartesian foundationalism is. A Cartesian foundationalist takes the fundamental items that justify everything else to be such that it is impossible that we be mistaken about them. So it has to be impossible to be mistaken about them. Good luck with that. These ultimate items, usually experience, have to be completely certain, or they cannot serve as appropriate foundations for everything else. And as a married person myself, who is actively listening to my wife, seeing the words come out of her mouth, I sometimes don't always hear absolutely everything. And therefore, I know that my wife cannot speak because I'm not absolutely certain of what she just said. And I dare not ask her again to repeat herself.
And we hope she doesn't see this.
That's all right. It's too far down.
Yeah.
Thus, for the Cartesian foundationalists, the foundational beliefs must meet extremely high rational standards, indeed too high. Cartesian foundationalism is most likely unattainable. Hold to the idea of Cartesian foundationalism Cartesianally. You can't. There we go.
Right. So since Cartesian foundationalism is unobtainable, and these Churchland and so forth, Papanow, believe that you have to have that kind of, foundation, they reject first philosophy, right? Because they see this foundationalism as a basis of first philosophy, and they reject it because you can't have this certainty. And of course, they hold to scientism. He says, if you look at the statements of Papanow and Churchland earlier in the chapter as to why some philosophers accept first philosophy, they both think that it's because they are Cartesian foundationalists. The idea is that if the assumptions of science are not completely certain and totally immune from error, then science is without adequate justification, and a skeptic about the claims of science wins. And of course, they don't want that, and so they reject this foundationalist idea, right? He says, but notice, nothing could be further from the truth. Today, most epistemologists are foundationalists, but he does not know of a single one who is a Cartesian foundationalist, right? In other words, Cartesian foundationalism was given up, he tells us, more than 50 years ago. Today, most foundationalists believe that certain experiences can serve as solid foundations for proper basic beliefs, but those experiences, he tells us, need not be immune from error. So you don't have to have absolute certainty in order to accept foundationalism. That's what he's suggesting here.
Right. Popenoe and Churchland are seriously mistaken in their rejection of first philosophy, but why do these scholars reject first philosophy? The answer turns out to be, well, pretty obvious. When we examine cases that are autonomous from science, outside the competency of science, such as the proper system of ethics, the nature of modal logic, and so forth, it becomes obvious that the basic issues in these areas of reflection have nothing to do with physics, chemistry, and so forth. The basic issues are not stated in scientific language, nor could debates about them be resolved by a scientific experiment. And here is that's the issue, right? It doesn't fall within the concept of what I want to talk about. Okay. Guess what? You might have to be a more well-rounded person.
That's right. Change the subject, right? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
All right. So that's the basic idea and why first philosophy is important. It's autonomy, and that sort of thing. Why it was rejected because it's based on foundationalism that folks assumed had to have certainty, and of course there is no certainty there, and therefore you reject foundationalism, you reject basic first philosophy. And he says, no, that's not necessarily the case. And so in conclusion, then, he says what he's done in this section is he's tried to clarify first philosophy by stating the autonomy and authority thesis with regard to first philosophy, right? It can stand on its own, and in some areas it has authority over scientific claims. He says he's argued that the rejection of first philosophy is based on weak arguments, right, like assumptions that Popenoe attempts to make, or a misunderstanding of why advocates of first philosophy hold to the view, like you have to have Cartesian foundationalism, right? No, you don't. And so now he tells us it's time to provide examples of the autonomy and authority thesis, and he wants to do that in the next chapter.
Right, exactly. And so that's what we'll be covering next time. Again, these last few chapters have been kind of progressive from building upon what's come before, but they all kind of have as well. And so, it's not just stating that there is a problem, but he's attempting to give us the answer to scientism as well. And so that's what we'll be covering, and we're going to continue on with chapter 10. And if you want to check back at all the other chapters, you can go to caveofthecross.com, go to the middle of the page, click on the book of Scientism and Secularism, and there you have all the cover photos to each individual episode, and you can find them there. There's playlist on YouTube. You can find it on Rumble, on Odyssey, on Spotify. I think that's all the video spots, including our website, and then all the audio can be found pretty much anywhere else. Type it up, throw it in the search engine of your favorite Google, non-Google version, and you'll find us. And that's how you've come to know us. So as always, the short clips and even the reels are being posted, and those are getting pretty decent responses. And so we appreciate all that. So join us next time as we continue to look on other truths that are not solely scientific ones in chapter 10. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.